Hello there. Thank you so much for joining me for this special episode of the show on the current state of politics, journalism, and social media in Canada. Coming up on the program tonight, politics and journalism. How does that intertwine with each other? I'll speak with a series of journalists, including host of The National, Adrienne Arsenault, host of CTV National News, Omar Sachedina, host of Global National, Dawna Friesen, Rick Mercer, former host of the Rick Mercer Report, and so many more. But let's begin tonight with some of those behind the scenes of being a journalist in this country here in Canada. Stories that are covered by journalists on a day-to-day basis. Well, let's hear from one of those journalists themselves. Let's bring in Adrienne Arsenault, host of The National and CBC News chief correspondent, who I spoke with earlier. The way in which Canadians receive the news has changed drastically over the past few decades. Not just that, but the actual news stories themselves have been changing. The issues that people care about, they've been changing, and therefore that comes along with it. The stories of which journalists covers has also changed. Joining me now to discuss that and more is Adrienne Arsenault, host of The National and newly named chief correspondent at CBC News. And she joins me now from the National studio in Toronto. Adrienne, thanks so much for making the time.
Oh, Wyatt, it's a total pleasure. I know you and I have been talking for a while about trying to do this, and the news always, it always gets in the way for us. So I'm really glad that we were able to do it.
Let's just start out with the piece that I mentioned as I was introducing our segment as it relates to just the stories in general, how they've changed over the past few decades. When you look specifically at your time working in journalism, what kind of stands out to you? What are some of the most memorable stories as of recently that you've covered? I mean, you were obviously quite instrumental in CBC's coverage of the death of Her Late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, et cetera. But what stands out to you?
Wyatt, it's such a great question. Like I love the question or the idea that there's been an evolution in news. For me, one of the most striking things I ever covered for a whole bunch of reasons was 9/11. In part, I mean, not just it was so crazy. I was living in Washington at the time, and we saw something happen with a plane in New York and ran into the office in Washington, and we couldn't figure out what it was. And we're making all these plans to go to New York, and then it came to us, right? Then the plane hit the Pentagon. And so for us, one of the challenges then, aside from just staying on top of it, was that I had this big drawer full of stories in progress that I was working on, and I opened the drawer, I took everything out, and I threw everything out, because no story that I'd been working on up to that point could ever be viewed through a lens that didn't include 9/11. All the interviews I did, I was doing stories about immigration, I was doing stories about the economy, about the place of the US and the rest of the world. They were all over. They were all done. Those stories could never be the same again. So to me, that was a big turning point in journalism. It really put this great big lens through everything, and it changed the news cycle. Wyatt, like before that, if something terrible happened, like a plane crash, for example, you'd probably see those stories last for maybe a week and a half, 2 weeks in the first block of a newscast. Well, after 9/11, something changed. So 2 months later, there was a plane crash in New York, and a plane sort of crashed literally onto a neighborhood. So if you can imagine, a plane full of people crashed onto a neighborhood, killed a bunch of people on the ground. That is the sort of story that before 9/11, people would have been talking about for probably at least 2 weeks. I think when they realized it wasn't terrorism, it was about 4 days worth of coverage broadly in the US and beyond. People's sense of what was a big news story changed. And I think since that era, things have accelerated strangely. So to me, those were stories that really made a difference in terms of the news cycle, if that makes any sense.
And like, how do those stories kind of stick with you from like obviously the events that you spoke of, 9/11, like all of that stuff happened a long time ago, but now here we are in 2022. Like when you do the work that you do on the national on a day-to-day basis, how, I guess, do you carry those stories with you? Do you think about like past stories when you're doing some of your current work?
I do all the time, all the time. Sometimes, things feel like they're repeating. Sometimes it's just sort of a really strong memory of a person. So when we started doing COVID, I immediately started thinking about Liberia in 2014 when Ebola was sort of coursing through Liberia. And I thought about it because, that was my first time covering a very serious virus that affected people's behaviors. So they weren't shaking hands. They weren't hugging anymore. This is a place where people like famous handshakes and big huggers, and it's a really tactile place. But they weren't doing any of that anymore. And if you were really close to someone who was sick, you were getting sick too. And so everything that was so fresh for the rest of us when COVID started happening, I just felt these echoes of it from covering Ebola. So sometimes the stories come back to you. You know what I mean? Not just the people, but the stories themselves.
And I mean, when you look at a story like, the death of Her Late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, for example, I mean, that was kind of a story that for, the mourning period that took place was, basically no one was talking about anything other than that because of how significant of a moment in history it is. But, that moment in history will obviously shape the royal family and will shape the way that various government systems move forward for the next few decades. When you reflect on moments like that in your career, covering moments like that in your career, what immediately comes to mind? And I mean, what are some of the highlights of covering not just necessarily the death of Her Late Majesty, but other events such as that? I mean, say, a monarch visiting Canada, for example, or when we had, at the time, Prince Charles visit Canada just this past spring.
So I think, firstly, your observation about the meaning of that moment is bang on. It is, we're lucky in our jobs, why to get to be witnesses to history. We get a curbside view, literally, of history. Often our cameras are genuinely set up on the curb as a convoy will go past or the hearse goes past. So we have this curbside view. So that's the first thing that comes to mind is like, oh my God, I can't believe the privilege of being able to do this. And then I think about, I've seen other moments, popes dying, popes being chosen, um, wars, the disengagement in Gaza back in 2005, which was when Israel removed its settlements from Gaza. That certainly at that time felt like a moment. The war with Hezbollah certainly at the time felt like a moment. And you don't often know in the moment how enduring it's going to end up being. For example, I was sitting here on March 11th, 2020. We were in the middle of the newscast and we hear a couple things. We hear that the NBA has canceled its season. We hear that Tom Hanks has COVID. That's the day the pandemic is declared. We knew it was big. I don't think we had any idea how big it was about to be. Sometimes it takes a long time to realize, oh my God, I was there for that. So I'm still in my career going back and looking at things and saying, I can't believe I was there for that.
And when you look at obviously all of the things that you've alluded to in your past few answers have taken place in, even some of them in the past year, looking at, for example, you say the Pope immediately coming to mind, obviously the Pope's apology to residential school survivors just this past summer, and then also looking at some of the other things that you had mentioned as well. When you look at moments like that, when you look at, a moment like the Pope coming to Canada as an example to make an apology to residential school survivors, on Canadian soil, or even an event such as, you mentioned a few wars, et cetera, such as the war between Russia and Ukraine, some of those big events that will shape history forever. How do you think those events will change history, and what does it mean that you got to be a part of covering those types of stories?
Well, sometimes what I find interesting about those moments is that when they start, there's a feeling of, ooh, this is big. But then as it progresses, there's an incremental feeling. And sometimes it takes a fair amount of distance before you appreciate it. And so I think I'll give you an example in COVID. Early on in COVID, when various governments started using COVID as a reason to block protests or block the movement of, that like in China, for example, where people were like locked into a neighborhood, or in Turkey, where certain types of protests were blocked, and we were told this is because of COVID. There was this tiny feeling like, oh, are we watching the beginning of something where COVID is used as cover for all sorts of autocratic regimes to crack down on things they don't like dissent? And then it just started happening, and people just started not accepting it, but seeing it as part of their lives, particularly, I mean, in China, it became particularly difficult for people, and it's a changed place. I look at Hong Kong when those democracy protests were happening, and we mistakenly had this feeling that something big was happening, right? This was a force to be reckoned with. This people power was extraordinary. We were on the streets. We were talking to people. Sorry, we're just adjusting some lights here in studio, so forgive me if it looks like I'm turning the lights off. I'm not. And then they're coming back on. So we thought at the time, wow, we are here witnessing the beginning of something. And what we didn't realize until later is that we were witnessing the end of something, because Hong Kong now is unrecognizable to what it was in 2019. And it is so much more ferociously tight. Sneeze. Excuse me. Who does that on TV? Sneezing. That's terrible. But it's so much more ferociously tight than it was, that we were actually watching a very sad ending to something. So it's hard in the moment, Wyatt, to call how it's going to end up. It takes time.
Okay, Adrienne Arsenault, host of The National and chief correspondent at CBC. Adrienne, thanks so much for making the time.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm so sorry I sneezed on your show. It's so rude.
And just recently, CTV National News named a new chief news anchor and senior editor, whose name is Omar Sachedina. Sachedina had worked for the company previously for CTV News and for Bell Media in numerous different capacities. Omar Sachedina joined me to discuss his love for journalism and what he hopes to accomplish as the new chief news anchor of CTV National News. Omar Sachedina is newly named chief anchor at CTV National News, and he is joining me now to discuss his time in journalism and what he makes of how journalism has progressed over the past few years. Omar, thanks so much for making the time.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Why don't we just start out with your new role, chief anchor at CTV National News? What do you hope to accomplish as anchor of one of Canada's most watched nightly newscasts?
Well, I think what we really need to do as a society is make sure we have conversations and really listen to each other and hear one another. I think conversations have become increasingly divided. People are becoming increasingly entrenched. There's a lot of focus on being right instead of really doing frankly what you're doing. I mean, you've been exceptional at having conversations, bringing people together, hearing different perspectives, and I think that really contributes to civil society and making sure that we really understand people's perspectives. Because I think, I have been incredibly fortunate with this job to be able to travel around the world and do all kinds of stories. And what I have found is that regardless of skin color or borders or countries or geography, everybody bleeds red. And what I mean by that is that we are all bound by the same feelings, emotions, things that make us human. And I think we need to focus on those ties. And I think we really need to focus on people's perspectives and making sure people feel heard at the end of the day.
And obviously, you haven't been chief news anchor for very long as of yet, but in some of your previous roles at CTV, and just as a journalist in general, what do you make of some of the most interesting stories that you've been able to cover, and what are some of the things that you might be looking forward to in the years ahead?
Yeah, you know what I'm so struck by everywhere I go is everybody has at the end of this day this deep desire and this deep capacity to hope for a better future. And I think that's what drives the vast majority of the people I meet. I remember being in Indonesia after tsunami, and there was a father who had lost everything. I mean, the dream home that he had built was completely gone. His kids were gone, his wife was gone, and yet even in the depths of that despair, um, during a time of his life where he really had nothing, he still showed up to the site of the devastation to help other parents look for their children who were also lost. And I was just, I just had to take a couple of minutes. It was such a jarring scene because there were actually, the Indonesian military was removing bodies from the scene as we were doing the interview. It was just a horrific sight while we were there, but he wanted to be there. He really wanted to be there and help other people even in their grief. And I just thought that was so remarkable. So I think what I always hang on to and what I always take away with, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Indonesia, whether it's Hong Kong, is people want to see a better world for themselves and their children, and they want to do the right thing, and they are willing to sort of stand up and push forward as best they can. It's not always easy. Life is full of ups and downs, but at the end of the day, it's about getting up, suiting up, showing up, and taking a step forward.
And what role do you think journalism plays in that, in ensuring that people can, I guess, be more optimistic about the state of things in Canada and around the world?
So I think there are a couple of things. I mean, one of the big things is what I mentioned, and that's about making sure that people with different perspectives have the space that they need and they deserve to be able to get their views across. So that's point A. And I think that journalism can really encourage those conversations and giving people an opportunity to get their voices across. And quite frankly, I think we need to all do that, is to be able to bring in perspectives that are reflective of the nation. And I also think that we need more stories of hope as well. There is a lot of stuff in this world that is that is distressing, that is disturbing. But I think we do also need to remind ourselves collectively as humans that we have this extraordinary capacity for strength and resilience. And I think that those stories also need to be showcased and profiled as well.
Okay, well, that was Omar Sachedina, chief news anchor at CTV National News. But Dawna Friesen, anchor of Global National, has covered everything from elections to conflicts, wars happening abroad, pandemics, so much stuff that has been covered, not just by Dawna, but by journalists across the country. I spoke with Dawna on exactly that and on what she hopes to accomplish in her time as anchor of Global National. Joining me now is anchor of Global National, Dawna Friesen. Dawna, thanks so much for making the time.
Oh, my pleasure.
Let's just start out with your role, anchor of Global National, anchoring one of Canada's most popular nightly newscasts. What ultimately do you enjoy most about anchoring, once again, Canada's most watched night, or one of Canada's most watched nightly newscasts?
Well, I was a reporter for years before I took on this role. And so, and I was in the field all the time, never on an anchor desk. So I know what's involved in that. And I learned how to, did that for years. Love it. Love being a reporter and outside the studio. So I acknowledge I was a little reticent about taking on this role because it's so stationary. And I was so used to being out everywhere all the time. So that was a challenge. But what I realized is that I sort of have oversight over so much now, as opposed to as a reporter, you're focused on your one story or your one what you're doing for that day or that week, depending on what you're working on. So it's a different way of, I guess, kind of approaching the day and approaching stories. And I can't get too deep into the weeds on every story. I have to kind of be above and sort of figure out how to fit the pieces together into the newscast and really, I guess, distill, as you know, from the vast amount of information that's out there, and distill that into something that will fit into our newscast every night.
And I mean, obviously, there's the big news stories that everyone will hear about in one way or another. I mean, most recently, or one most recent story as it relates to the passing of Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, something the whole world was following. And then locally in Canada, if you look at things like the Conservative leadership race or the last federal election, like issues that are brought up and talked about repeatedly. But I mean, as anchor of Global National, how much do you value, how much do you enjoy covering perhaps, I guess, smaller stories that maybe aren't as popular amongst people, but are still, in many cases, just as meaningful?
That's a great question, Wyatt, because a lot of people ask, oh, who's the most famous person you interviewed, or what was your, who have you met? And I think I have never personally been terribly interested in that, in kind of that celebrity side of things, or even leadership roles, though there are some leaders that are really fascinating and interesting to try to mine their minds. But I'm really more interested, and always have been through my career, in ordinary people doing extraordinary things. I think people who either find themselves kind of through no kind of planning, find themselves in a position where they are front and center in something and need to make decisions, or they have just are quietly working away, quietly toiling, and don't get the attention that the louder, more visible voices do. And so, I find that more gratifying, more meaningful, and I always have.
And obviously, there's, in addition to that, lots of big stories, as we talked about. What have been some of the most memorable stories, things that, I've spoken with Adrienne Arsenault, Omar Sachedina, about some of those big stories that they've covered over the course of their careers. When you think about your time as a journalist, as anchor of Global National, what are some of those things that you think you'll carry with you for even after your time in journalism?
Oh, I'm glad you talked to Adrienne and Omar, both fantastic journalists. Adrienne's a good friend of mine, so I know she's done an awful lot in her career too. I think that looking back, I would say it's the times that I was in places where there was conflict. So whether that's in the Palestinian territories or Gaza or Iraq during the Iraq War, or in Syria. I was in Syria before the war started there. But it was, so I think Afghanistan as well. I think what I learned and took away from all those experiences, first of all, is how grateful I am to be Canadian, and how I like to remind people all the time that if you were born in Canada or you managed to get Canadian citizenship, it's like you won the lottery of birth or of life to be in this country. And we should never lose sight of how grateful we should be for what we have here, and preserve the rule of law, and preserve democracy, and preserve just kindness towards each other, because there are so many places where that has all fallen apart. And when it falls apart, it's not the people generally on the upper echelons of society that suffer, it's the ordinary people who are caught in a conflict that had nothing to do with them. So that's what I saw in all those places, and was always astonished by the resilience of people, the kindness of people, and the ability, the sort of triumph of the human spirit to overcome so much that, again, was not anything that they did to deserve.
And I mean, personally, like, just kind of speaking bluntly, myself as a journalist, like it can be quite easy to kind of get caught up in the news journalism, political kind of world bubble. How do you, like, when you are actually doing your reporting, always keep, you mentioned kind of ordinary people who maybe don't follow the news as much as, say, you or I would. How do you always keep those people at the heart of your reporting and at the heart of your role as anchor of Global National?
You know, I think maybe because maybe partly because of my background, because I grew up on a farm. I didn't grow up with any wealth. I grew up very poor. You know, in a farming family in Manitoba. So I feel, although I'm not in that world anymore, I feel those are my roots. And so I feel connected to that, and I never lose sight of that. And I also know that people who maybe don't have some top job, aren't some executive, haven't gone to university, don't live in cities, those people are incredibly hardworking and incredibly smart, and have a real kind of sense of fundamental sense of what's right and wrong and all of that stuff. So all of that informs me when I mean, not in a kind of, I'm not conscious of it, but I think that's how I have grown up and how I approach people generally, and stories in particular. If that makes some sense.
And I mean, when you look at just in general how Canadians are feeling and the way in which journalism has evolved, I mean, the way in which Canadians even get their news has changed. I mean, you know, even just a decade ago, 10 years ago, say newspapers, a lot more people relied on them than today, whereas today a lot of people relying on streaming services, television, and online news. Do you think there are any negatives to that? And I guess just how do you compare some of those positives to the negatives as it relates to the rise of, you know, social media and news that is coming from kind of the online world of things?
Well, I think we live in an era when there's far more information than there ever has been at our fingertips. So that should be on the surface a positive, right? Except it's turned into such a negative. So I think our role as journalists is to distill that, to take that fire hose of information and try to find the points that both have meaning and have truth and are important to people, and shed all the other stuff, because there's so much misinformation and disinformation, and it's so easy to be caught in that. That is the real downside of the internet, as we all now know. And the negative the nefarious actors, whether they're, you know, foreign governments or just people who are trying to make money, take advantage of that. And so, you know, I think about you, and I think about my son who's just started university. You have access to just volumes of information that I, as a kid, never did. And I think, wow, what amazing resource, right? You can go online and find anything about it. You can, as you're doing, you can reach out to people and talk to them like this, one-on-one. And so that is, I think, gives your generation a huge lift above what I had as a kid, right? It's how you use that information. It's how you take that volume of stuff and process it, and what you do with it that matters. And obviously you're a person who's clearly intent on being a force for good, and so many people are. But that's what we have to stay focused on. And you know, and I worry deeply about the way some societies are going, particularly the United States. We'll see in the US midterms what happens, but there are so many people in the United States who continue to believe that the election was stolen, that Donald Trump actually won. It's a lie, but it's now so embedded in so many people's minds that I don't know how we as journalists fight against that.
Okay, Dawna Friesen, anchor of Global National. Dawna, thanks so much for your time, and thanks so much for providing such insightful answers. Really appreciate it.
Oh, Wyatt, it's such a pleasure. Thank you so much. And I wish you all the best.
Thank you, you as well.
Okay.
Well, one face well known to Canadians and to the living rooms of Canadians and to television screens right across Canada is Rick Mercer, when he was the host, of course, of the Rick Mercer Report. This hour has 22 minutes, and most recently, Comedy Night on CBC. I spoke with Rick Mercer earlier about the state of politics in this country, the state of social media, and his time as host of the Rick Mercer Report. Rick Mercer is the former host of the Rick Mercer Report and now host of Comedy Night on CBC. Rick, thanks so much for making the time.
Thank you for having me.
Let's just start out with the Rick Mercer Report, something that obviously, is well known to many Canadians from across the country, some of the books that you've written, etc. What are you most proud of in your career as host of the Rick Mercer Report, now host of this new show, Comedy Night on CBC?
That's a great question. There's a lot of things that I was proud of about the Mercer Report. It ran for 16 seasons, which is almost unheard of. I was very proud of the number of places that we visited around the country. I always thought it was a chance, the show was a chance for me to take one part of the country and show it off to another part of the country. And it really became a bit of a travelogue, and I was proud of that. I think one of my proudest moments was when I started the Mercer Report. People knew who I was because I was on another TV show, This Hour's 22 Minutes. And sometimes I'd be shooting in a town and I'd see a kid and they would say, "What are you doing here?" Because a lot of kids, that's the way they think of their hometown. Like, "Oh, why would you come here?" And about a year and a half into the show, I was in northern British Columbia in a small town. And this kid saw me and he said, "I knew you'd show up eventually." And I realized that people kind of got the show now, that I was going everywhere. And I was very proud of that.
And I mean, when you look at a show like the Rick Mercer Report or your new show, or even This Hour Has 22 Minutes, as you alluded to in your last answer, when you look at all of those shows that you've done combined, what goes through your head when I guess you think of the number of Canadians who watched the show? Now the show's over, but obviously you're still writing books. Canadians are still very much familiar with Rick Mercer.
I guess I'm just glad that I was working and I had the opportunity to do as much work as I did, because that is the hardest thing about show business, or whether it's the theater or whether you want to work in television or whatever. It's finding consistent employment. That's the hardest thing. So I consider myself very lucky that I've worked for as long as I have. I think when I look back, I'm just shocked that so much time passed. This is what happens. 1 minute you're your age, and then the next minute you're my age. This is what happens. And then you go, "Oh my God, I've been working for 30 years. And so I think that was my biggest takeaway. I'm just proud that I could do the work and I had the opportunity to do the work.
And just shifting gears a little bit with, just Canada as a whole right now, obviously, you can look at that in many aspects, the political lens of things, the just overall state of the country, etc. What do you make of, obviously, the ongoing pandemic, something that's been going on for a while now? We're getting out of the pandemic and other issues seem to be arising. What do you make specifically of, I guess, the unity aspect, how united Canadians are? And I kind of am wondering about that, just because, a show like yours, the Rick Mercer Report, comedy, something that very much brings Canadians together.
Well, I was very proud of the fact that we had an audience in Alberta, and we had an audience in English Quebec, and we had an audience pretty much everywhere. I was very proud of that, because the country, sometimes you can really dwell on the differences and see, there's a lot of forces at play that will often pit East versus West and French versus English and rural versus urban. And there's been a lot of that talked about, but I was very happy that the show was watched all over the country. And I've been bemoaning for a long time that the notion of nation building has kind of gone away. We don't seem to do that the way we used to do it in the past. But I think the union is strong. I think there are always times where you see storm clouds on the horizon. Right now in Alberta, we have a new premier who is sounding very much like a separatist Quebec leader. In fact, she's proudly saying that's the playbook she's going to draw from, which is very unfortunate. I find it very unfortunate when Quebec plays those games, and now that someone else is saying, we're going to play the same games. It's just not going to help anyone. So sometimes it's a bit depressing, but by and large, I believe that we are one of the greatest countries in the world that you could possibly live in, and I think most Canadians, when push comes to shove, we're going to make sure that we stay united.
And I mean, you alluded to the kind of the political aspect of things, and obviously it's known to Canadians from across the country that the divide between political leaders, whether it be in Canada or around the world, seems to be growing. You know, you look even to the United States as an example with, you know, the current president and some of his potential opponents in the next presidential election, et cetera. So I just, what do you make of the current political aspect of that? And what do you make of, you know, the current state of politics becoming increasingly divisive in, again, not just Canada, but around the world?
There's a lot there. There's a lot to unpack right there. You know, fewer and fewer people trust anything. People are being told, people in Florida are told, get out of the way, a giant hurricane is coming. And they say, I don't believe you. I'm just going to stay here. This is what people don't trust science anymore. People don't trust the weather. They don't trust their political leaders. They're very suspicious of many things, and we have more and more factions of individuals that just talk to one another in an echo chamber online. It makes unity very difficult. There was a time when the entire world, or all of America, tuned in to listen to Walter Cronkite, and they believed what he said. And now everyone's tuning into a newscast that suits their own ideology, and then they only believe half of what they see, even though it's the newscast that they've chosen. It's very, you know, it's tough. It's not the greatest situation, that's for sure.
And then just lastly, before we conclude, when you look again at the unity aspect of Canadians, when you look at how Canadians are going about their everyday lives now, just a very simple question, but what do you ultimately think needs to be done in order to bring Canadians together?
Well, I don't think Canadians are that far apart necessarily. If we keep the premise of the question, what can we do to bring Canadians together? Canadians come together when parts of Newfoundland are wiped out by a hurricane. People in Western Canada, people in Quebec, they respond. When there's fires in Fort McMurray, people from every part of Canada, they respond with incredible generosity. And they go to bed at night thinking about those people in Fort McMurray. And I think that that's something that we have to remind ourselves. There's incredible rivers of generosity that flow through the entire country. And that's something that we all have in common, every single part of the country. And that's something that we should constantly remind ourselves.
Okay, Rick Mercer, former host of the Rick Mercer Report and also former host of This Hour Has 22 Minutes. Rick Mercer, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You too. Joining me now is the host of Primetime Politics on CPAC, Michael Serapio. Michael, thanks for joining me.
Oh, you're very welcome. Good to be here.
Let's just start out with your new role as host of Primetime Politics on CPAC. You've been in the chair on CPAC since September, the middle of September. What do you make of your new role? How has it been going so far, and what are you looking forward to?
You know what? It's been great. It's been great to come back to Ottawa. I worked on the Hill many years ago for CTV, and that was before CBC. So coming back to cover politics is great. This is a great team here. It's not as big as CTV or CBC, but the amazing thing is CPAC is filled with people who are really committed to what they do, who really are committed to this idea of furthering democracy and bringing really democracy as it unfolds to Canadians across the country. So to be a part of that is huge, and I'm having a lot of fun with it.
And I mean, one thing about CPAC, obviously, it's directly covering the affairs of Parliament on a day-to-day basis, covering the issues that are happening in Parliament and that are most relevant to Canadians. What are you looking forward to in terms of covering the issues, in terms of covering the issues that matter to everyday Canadians and ultimately to your viewers on CPAC?
Well, you know, I don't know if it's any one issue that's coming up right now. I think in broad stroke, for me, when I was thinking about what I wanted to do with my life when I was around your age, it became very clear that, you know, I do believe that we all in this life have a contribution to make. And I kept thinking about what I could do in service to Canadians and to others. And for me, it was essentially telling stories in order to further understanding. And as I went along that path, it became much more clear to me that a cornerstone of liberal democracies is to have a free press. And so to be involved in that process, I think is an honor. It's a challenge. And so on those levels, I look forward to it. But we're also, entering this very interesting time. We have here a minority government that has a deal with the NDP for the next few years in order to stay in power. We're going to have to see how long that lasts. We have a much more energized opposition right now that is bringing issues to the House of Commons in a way that probably has not been done as concertedly in the last couple of years. We've also seen changes, for example, in Quebec with François Legault getting a far more energized majority in Quebec. We have in Danielle Smith in Alberta, a province that continues to express their frustration, or at least many within the province. I don't want, no, you can't speak with the uniform voice. It's not one colossus, but there are many in the province that have gone to Danielle Smith because they are expressing that frustration. So I think we're in this very interesting time where we as media can take those stories, share it with Canadians to help them make sense of it. They can do what they will with the information, but in that way, further our democracy by getting the information out there, getting understanding and facts out there without all the noise sometimes that gets in the way, be it in the form of anger and or misinformation.
And just lastly, before we conclude on the last piece you mentioned with anger, misinformation, et cetera, what do you make of the role that is playing in politics and journalism today with, people not necessarily caring so much about the facts as opposed to their own personal opinions?
Yeah, I don't know what you mean by that. I don't know if you're referring to individual people that are entering media.
No, just
whether.
No, like say like Canadians who are using social media on a day-to-day basis to say criticize politicians, criticize journalists, et cetera. Just what do you make of the role in which they are playing?
Well, I think there's always been that role. Social media has really amplified it, and it really has changed the dynamic around which the conversation is happening. But from the very beginning, if you go to Rome and look at the what was happening then, people used graffiti to express their discontent. People used letters to the editor, decades later, centuries later, to express their discontent. And we're now at the point where people are expressing their opinions far more readily on social media. And so on one level, that has democratized the process. On the other, it does present a challenge in terms of making sure that what we do is distinct from the misinformation and opinion. And I will applaud many journalists in this country, the vast majority of journalists in the country, who work very hard at that. And I've said it before, but I think the best thing that we can do is really be insistent about our role as journalists. And so that is to, despite whatever criticism is leveled at us, in particular the unfair criticism, or in my case, I've had homophobic things said to me, racist things said to me. Despite those things, I think we need to be consistent, insistent about just staying with the facts, telling the story, sharing what has been said, sharing the debates, despite all the noise around it. And I think that insistence and consistency is going to be our way through, because you're never going to be able to cancel out all the noise. But if people know that there's a source out there that they can turn to that is not opinion, that is fact-based, that is not trying to further an agenda, then I think that will, at the end of the day, stand the testament of time, and will be the places that people turn to. Because even if people are making comments on social media, when something happens of great importance, people are still turning to the media organizations that they trust. And so for us, I think to engender that trust, our day-to-day has to be very on the line, and we have to be very clear about our principles, and again, be insistent in our role as being media within a liberal democracy.
Okay, host of Primetime Politics, Michael Serapio. Michael, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Joining me now is the Globe and Mail's Ottawa Bureau Chief, Bob Fife. Bob, thanks so much for making the time.
Happy to do so.
Let's just start out with some of those biggest stories happening on Parliament Hill right now, and some of the stories that you yourself as a journalist have covered over your time in journalism. What do you make of how journalism has evolved, how the stories in which are reported in the news have evolved over the past few decades?
Well, I don't think that the stories change very much from what I was doing 40 years ago to today. I mean, you know, issues of the economy and inflation. If inflation is bad, we cover. If there are scandals, whether it was during the Maroney years or the Chrétien years or the Trudeau years, are scandals, and we cover them. So I don't really think that journalism itself has changed very much. But what I think what's changed is the rise of social media, and I think it's been very poisonous to politics, and I think into society as a whole, where you have people who hide behind anonymity and say outrageous stuff, and you're also seeing that, you know, political parties use bots as well to be able to attack our opponents or attack members of the media, or to you know, go after people that they perceive to be against their particular political interests. So that, I think, is a different issue. My big concern has been the decline in mainstream media. As you know, communities across the country do not have local newspapers anymore. If you look at the post media papers, they are pretty thin. If you pick up whether it's the Calgary Herald or the Ottawa Citizen or whatever, they're not what they used to be. And you know, the decline of newspapers in particular in communities, but also nationally, I think is a really big concern to me. And I'll give you a good example. When I started 1978, Canadian Press had about 26 reporters, and every major newspaper had a correspondent on Parliament Hill, and they even the major newspapers covered every major department, whether it was defense or finance department, health department, consumer affairs. Everybody had an Indigenous reporter. The Toronto Star, the Globe and Mail, all of the major newspapers did. Nowadays, there are no longer any city that has a correspondent in Ottawa. I think the Winnipeg Free Press just closed down their Ottawa bureau. Canadian Press maybe has about 6 reporters. And that means, Wyatt, that probably about 75 to 80% of what goes on in government is no longer being covered. We don't know what they're doing with our taxpayers' dollars, what they're doing in terms of kind of policies that may be good or may be bad. And I think that, to me, is a real disservice and a threat to democracy, because if we don't know what our government is doing, we don't have the resources to cover them properly. You know, Canadians have no idea then how their government is performing, good or bad.
And I mean, just to pick up on the one piece you mentioned with the increased usage of social media, obviously that is, I'm sure, a very positive thing for not just us as journalists, but for Canadians to be able to use, not just to express their views, but to find out the actual news as to what is going on. But what do you make of some of the negatives, some of the consequences to the ongoing usage of social media by everyday Canadians in the world of, you know, politics, whether it's, you know, criticizing a politician, criticizing a journalist, etc.?
Okay, well, there are some positive things, obviously. Let's use Twitter as an example, just because I use Twitter and I don't use TikTok or some of these other, or Instagram, for example. You know, Twitter is very good. I follow, you know, the New York Times, the Washington Post, obviously the political leaders, politicians that I think are, you know, smart and have good views on things, diplomats, all of that sort of stuff. And it's a good tip service. as well, because if you often find out first on Twitter that, a change has happened or the announcement is going to come. What concerns me is that, and particularly female reporters, but also female politicians, there's a lot of hate directed at them. And this direct is hated at them because people can get away with it. Twitter allows anonymity, and they can say all kinds of stuff that if they were required to put their name, like I do and you do on Twitter, you have your own name, I have my own name. So I'm responsible for what I say. And that means if you say something that's misogynist or racist or defamatory, I can take you to court. But you can't do that because you're, for many of these people who say these horrible things, because they hide behind anonymity. And I thought, my view is if Twitter was required by government to say that anybody on your site, you can we're all for free speech, but anybody on your site has to have their name. They have to have the real person. And I bet you that a lot of that hate and vile stuff would end pretty darn quickly. A, because people would face the threat of defamation. But secondly of all, a lot of people would probably not want their neighbors to know that they said these terrible things about, Michelle Rempel, for example, or, Rachel Gilmore of Global TV has had some really disgusting sexist stuff said about her, actually, and violent stuff. And racialized members of parliament and racialized members of the media have had racist stuff spewed out against some by these kind of people. That, I think, would go a long ways to kind of cleaning up what is becoming a sewer.
Okay, Globe and Mail Ottawa Bureau Chief Bob Fife. Bob, thanks so much for making the time. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Bye-bye, Wyatt.
Thank you. Ryan Jesperson is host of Real Talk with Ryan Jesperson, and he joins me now to talk about the importance of independent media and where that falls into today's journalism. Ryan, thanks so much for making the time.
Oh, Wyatt, it's always a pleasure when our paths cross. Thank you for the invitation.
Let's just start out with the first piece I mentioned. What do you ultimately think of, journalism today and the, easiness to start your own operation, to start your own program, et cetera, whether it's a podcast, an online show, et cetera?
Yeah, well, I guess look at you. Look who's talking. What you're doing is remarkable. And we're pretty proud of what we do as well. Weekdays on Real Talk at ryanjesperson.com, which is, about an hour or 75 minutes of independent talk. And of course, available streaming live on YouTube, available by podcast, a reflection really strategically and obviously in response to where and how and when people are accessing their media. And of course, what will remain true despite interruptions to the business side or big shakeups to the organizational structure that impacts journalism in the boardrooms and beyond, is the general public's need and desire to have information presented to them and then dissected and discussed. And of course, there are business elements to all of it with regards to how we keep our lights on and how we pay our staff. But what is irrelevant, really, quite frankly, is who owns the entities that are driving those conversations. And as we've seen journalism dying on the vine, in particular, more on the local front, I look at some of the coverage, television and newspaper coverage in small and medium-sized towns and cities across Canada, and how that has really been decimated, and how people, Canadians across the country, really are underserved when it comes to the local discussion and coverage that they need to better understand their communities. It reiterates to me how incredibly important media is. And if the business model opens the door, like you alluded to, for more independent entities like us and like you, then that's a good thing.
And how do you feel it is perhaps easier, perhaps harder, depending on your opinion, but to share stories the same way that, mainstream media would through, programs such as your own?
Yeah, I mean, well, I guess it's interesting, isn't it? Because let me make 2 points. I think number one, nothing's easy about it. If people knew how hard you work, Wyatt, to line up your interviews and to do your show, or if people knew how hard we work to build a new studio and to create the technical infrastructure to do what we do, then I think they might be a little bit surprised. But at the same time, if you look at what was possible like 20 years ago, this would have been impossible, right? People didn't have access to live streaming channels on YouTube. People wouldn't certainly have had an opportunity to start up their own broadcast entity without a license, without approval from the CRTC, without millions of dollars of technical infrastructure, including satellites, towers. You just couldn't do it. And so now, obviously, with the advent and the affordability of technology, broadcasters or storytellers like you, like me, and like others across the country and around the world are able to do what we do. Of course, the challenge is as well ensuring that we stay on the radar of the general public, of our target audience. And the legacy media, the corporate media, the so-called mainstream media will always have an advantage, or will have an advantage for the foreseeable future, because of their deep pockets, because of their baked-in audiences. But independent entities like us are chipping away at those audiences, because I think that we offer something that's more real, that's more authentic, that in some circumstances is more local and more meaningful, relevant, and it delivers with regards to what people are looking for. And so we slowly but surely, with work every single day, both in front of the camera and behind the scenes, put in that work to build those audiences. And it's exciting when we see those audiences grow.
And you mentioned challenges, some of the challenges that might arise from something like that. What have been some of your biggest challenges through, I guess, just doing your show again online without some of the, resources that you could say mainstream media have access to?
Yeah, well, let me say first and foremost that even right now, I have one of our talented team members that's helping me make this interview happen. And without a talented team, this stuff wouldn't happen. But you ask anybody that's involved in an independent media entity, they'll tell you that everybody has to do the jobs of 2 or 3 people. Now, that's at least the way compared to how things used to be, right? Where you'd have technical engineers and you'd have all sorts of talented people behind the scenes that could make things happen. But budgets have become more tight. And teams, when we talk about broadcast teams or teams that create journalism, have been pared down and have been cut down. And even in mainstream media, the big budget media, those people, both in front of and behind the camera, have had to learn to do the work of 2 or 3 people. So that's one of the challenges, really trying to figure out exactly how to make this all happen. That's one of the challenges. Another challenge is just the reality of not having the structure and the infrastructure. We don't have a CEO and a board of directors, and we don't have station managers across the country. We don't have dozens of journalists that we can deploy around the world to cover the big stories. We have to do it a little bit differently. We're bootstrapped, we're grassroots. But with every big win, with every interview where we get an exclusive, or where we drive a public conversation, or where we see an uptick in our audience, whether that's our subscribers, whether that's how people are engaging with what we're doing, those are the small wins that keep us going.
Okay, host of Real Talk with Ryan Jesperson. Ryan, thanks so much for making the time. Really appreciate it.
Hey, Wyatt, it's great to see you again, my friend. Keep up what you're doing. It's fantastic to see.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ryan. Graham Richardson is chief news anchor at CTV News Ottawa, and he is with me now. Graham, thanks so much for joining me.
Great to be here, Wyatt.
Let's just begin with your time in journalism, specifically touching on CTV News Ottawa, a local news station in the nation's capital. What do you foresee as the importance of local journalism as compared to, national outlets that cover national affairs and the entire country?
I think I like to say, and I'm a bit biased on this front, I like to say people care more about the garbage pickup and the sign bylaw than they do the Constitution. I'm a former national reporter as well, but I think the closer you get to something that's relevant to your life, whether that's schools, traffic, healthcare, all of it is local. And so when we connect with an audience, the greatest connection always comes with something they can relate to, and that is the obviously the definition of local news. So that's why I think no matter what form we take, whether it's a discussion like this, whether it's a podcast, whether it's a conventional broadcast, there will always be a place for what happened down the street and how it impacts my life.
And when you look at things like that with, the issues that actually impact people more so on a day-to-day basis, whereas, national news potentially covering things that may impact people, one time or later on down the road, et cetera. What have been some of the most interesting things you could say as a local news reporter that you've, covered? And has there been anything that surprised you in your switch from being a national reporter, as you mentioned, to moving into a local newsroom?
Yeah, I'm surprised every day. Today, we're doing a story right now on a woman who contacted us who can't get a family doctor. And she's had a family doctor, and he stopped 250 people from his practice. He basically cut them off. And she's a cancer survivor, and she needs mammograms. So I'm surprised that that's happening. That's a local story. I think overall, on bigger pictures, I think the biggest surprise for me, well, the biggest story of my life, of all of our lives, is the pandemic. It was the lead story for months and years all around the world. And it was different in every single city and even inside the city of Ottawa, for instance, it was different from ward to ward and area to area. So the breadth and depth of that story and the impact it had and continues to have, I think surprises me to this day, how far reaching it is, how it touches every aspect of our lives, whether it was concerts, school, health, safety, long-term care homes, like every age group, right? So that's still, I'm still coming to terms with that. And I think I don't think we as a society have come to terms with that or will in many, many years.
Okay, Chief News Anchor at CTV News Ottawa, Graham Richardson. Graham, thanks so much for making the time.
Anytime, Wyatt. Thanks for asking me.
Thank you. Joining me now, CP24 anchor and reporter Mark Liverman. Mark, thanks so much for making the time.
Absolutely. Happy to be here, Wyatt.
Let's just start out. I mean, some of the other people that I've spoken with over the course of this special program on their roles in journalism and what they make of how journalism has evolved over the past many decades, I feel might be a little bit different since you work for a station that very much is 24/7 news coverage. What do you make of the way that you and CP24 covers such a 24/7 news environment going on 24/7?
That is a great question. I think it's a different beast than anything I've ever worked at before. I've spent the last decade working in the States, a kind of more traditional local and national TV station, CBS News in New York, CBS News National based out in New York, CBS in Phoenix. With CP24, there's this, I think they're ahead of their time in the sense that they've created a model that I don't think anybody else for some reason seems to be jumping on board with, in that you're able to get your information in real time with a bunch of other information coming through at the same time. I think that screen format is something that's a game changer. It was a game changer 20 years ago when they started this model, or even more than that. And it's still to this day is a game changer, because even if you're starting to stream your news online or whatnot, you've got this screen where you could put us on mute and still be getting all your information all day long in real time. On top of that, I think our model, probably more than anything I've ever seen, including in the US, and I think a lot of models need to jump on board with this, is the fact that we are live, we're reactionary, and we're present. So it's a conversation. I've always looked at CP24 more than any other station I've ever worked at as a conversation. It's a conversation with the city, and I love it. It's like nothing I've ever seen. It's something to get used to, and it's you're live a lot, so you have to be on a lot more than I've ever been used to in my entire life, or my entire career. But you're literally the fact that it was called City Pulse makes sense, because it really is, you really feel like you're the pulse of the city. You're getting reaction to what's happening now. And it's a game changer. I honestly, I cannot fathom how more news stations in our transition to more streaming services and to more just online platforms are not getting on board with this, because the CP24 model works in that way. I think as we start to see more and more viewers leave local TV and leave TV, they're moving towards streaming platforms to get their information in real time. CP24's already beat them to it, because they're doing it by TV and online. So it's a long answer why I feel passionate about it, but I think it's a game changer format.
Steve Paikin is host of The Agenda with Steve Paikin on TPO. He's with me now. Steve, why don't we just begin with your time in journalism and what you make of how kind of the various timestamps along the way. What are some of the changes that you've noticed in kind of the journalism lens, covering politics through the journalism lens?
Sure. First of all, I should apologize for my appearance. As you can tell, it's Thanksgiving weekend and I'm up at the cottage. And so I'm not as nattily attired as you are, Wyatt. You look very elegant today, but I'm decidedly dressed down. Anyway, apologies for that. Well, the biggest difference, and this is going to sound like Stone Age is the way I describe it, but when I was first a City Hall reporter 40 years ago at Toronto City Hall, I used to sling a tape recorder over my shoulder and would go out and get interviews. And when I brought them back to my office, I used to have to take those interviews from my audio cassette tape, transfer them to a reel-to-reel tape, and then with a razor blade, I would actually cut the tape with the clips on it that I wanted to use in my reports, and take that tape and with a piece of Scotch tape on one end and a piece of Scotch tape on the other end, insert them into my reports. I mean, if you think about it, it was kind of like Stone Ages. Nowadays, it's of course all very fancy and digital, but back then, that's the way we did things. And even when I went to TVO, which is now 30 years ago, I don't think I could send an email when I first started at TVO. I think email was only just starting at the provincial broadcaster. And of course, now everything is different. So the biggest difference, you'd have to say, is technology. Technology allows you to do so much more. It allows you to do so much more differently. But that, Wyatt, also comes with consequences. And one of the consequences is things move so quickly now, and you are feeding so many different beasts now that you don't have as much time to think as you used to. And I think that comes with a price.
And so let's dive a little bit deeper into some of those consequences, some of those negatives to the increasing usage of social media, not just, pertaining to journalism. Journalists use social media for their work to share the facts and to share the news of the day with, in this case, Canadians, Ontarians, etc., whatever the case may be. But when you look at, users using various social media platforms to, in many cases, respond to the work of journalists, what have you noticed on that front?
Well, social media is the best and worst of everything, right? In terms of the best, I can well remember covering an event at Toronto Pearson Airport, where they had just opened a brand new, I think it was a $600 million Union Pearson Express. And this was going to be a faster, cheaper, more elegant, more comfortable way of traveling from either Union Station or other points inside the city, right up to Pearson Airport. And it is a great way to go. But it was not without its challenges at the beginning. And I remember when Premier Kathleen Wynne opened the thing, I was live tweeting the news conference that she was having at Pearson Airport. And as I was doing so, I noticed that people were contacting me via Twitter and saying, ask her this, ask her that. What about this? What about that? And I thought, this is fantastic. This is the job reporters are supposed to do, right? They're supposed to be a conduit between the politicians who make the decisions and the people who elect those politicians and on whom the decisions have an impact. And I thought this was wonderful. And I remember saying to Premier Wynne right in the middle of the press conference, I have so-and-so here tweeting me from such and such a place, and they want to know. And I was, in effect, the proxy of the audience, passing those questions from the listeners, viewers, readers, whatever, to the decision makers. So that was, in my view, Twitter at its best, making that link between the governed and the governors. Obviously, there's the other side of social media, which is that it has become violent, vicious, ugly, uncivil. People have forgotten how to communicate in a normal, civilized way. And we need to do something about that, because there will be just a whole lot of people who have no interest in communicating in such an uncivil fashion, and they're being left out of those exchanges. And if people could just kind of bevel their edges a bit and not be so personally vicious with ad hominem attacks, I think it would be better. But that day is not yet with us, and who knows if it ever will be.
And so then just lastly, before we conclude, actually your work as a journalist, what have been some of the most memorable topics? Obviously you cover politics at Queen's Park regularly for Ontario's broadcaster TVO. What do you make of how the politic lens of things has changed, and specifically maybe reflect on some of those important stories that you've covered?
Well, certainly from my standpoint, the biggest change is that when I started out, you were mostly filing for example, my first job in television was at CBC News, and you're basically filing for 6 o'clock news. And after the 6 o'clock news was over, you might fix up the piece a little bit more for the 11 o'clock newscast. You might get another interview and, just update the piece a little bit. But essentially you're filing for once, maybe twice a day. And now, of course, there's no such thing as filing for a particular time. You're filing all the time. And if you're reporting on social media, you're doing everything in real time. If you're filing for a television station, there might be a noon newscast. There might be an all news channel. So it doesn't matter what time, you're getting it in as quickly as you can. There's just constant updating of stories throughout the day as you go along. So it almost doesn't matter what the story is. Nowadays, there's an expectation that you will just constantly be constant. And, to come full circle with where we started with this, on the one hand, it's great because viewers can tune in whenever they want and get the most up-to-date information and get continued updates throughout the day. And that's good. But on the other hand, where I used to get, if I were putting a piece together for 6 o'clock news, where I used to get sort of 5, 6, 7, 8 hours a day to think about how I wanted the piece to come together, that's not the case anymore. As soon as I've got the piece, I've got no time to think about it. I'm putting it together right away. And then if I'm doing updates, I'm putting those together right away. And the notion that you'd actually get a few hours time to think about how you want to shape the piece, what different kinds of comments you want. Do I want to go this way or do I want to go that way? Those kinds of decisions have to be made every time you do a story. And there's less and less time to think about those decisions. And the consequences of that, I would suggest, are you make more mistakes, you can't go as in depth, you don't think about all the potential permutations of how you can tell a story, and just the constant feeding of the beast means you get more in some ways, but less in other ways. And I have no idea how to resolve that conundrum, but that's where it's at.
Okay, anchor and host of The Agenda with Steve Paikin. Steve, thanks so much for making the time.
And Red Sox fan, although this was not a good year. I don't know why I'm wearing this right now, but we'll get them next year, as they say. Thanks, Wyatt. Good to see you again.
Thank you as well.